Welcome, listeners, to another installment of our series, Mapping the Wilderness Journey and Path. It's great to have you with us. Today's episode is part 2 sequence that builds upon the previous episode. It's structured around a conversation between Adrian Machen and Beth Whiting. In it, they are exploring the challenges and opportunities for choosing authentic living. Today's installment has a very simple and clear-cut packaging, even though it seeks to still cover the expanse, the breadth and depth of what it means to live authentically. The purpose of this podcast for the listener is to help deepen our collective experience, insight, and understanding around making authentic choices as a lived experience in today's world. The conversation features Adrian and Beth's own first-hand experience and learning, whilst drawing meaning and value from the two evocative pieces used in the last podcast, The Painted Room and Queen. Every podcast this far has held a piece of evocative word. Adrian wishes to keep the design, so a very short reflective piece called Who Am I has been included to open this discussion and to bring a tone of receptivity and search. So without further delay, let us dive into the piece Who Am I, and then what Beth and Adrian has created together from their unscripted conversation.
Who am I? Who am I from all that has become me? How do I leave the house and the rooms of my parents and family in order to find myself? Where is my capacity when only fear seems to prevail? Where is the trail in the wilderness? Why do I keep failing myself? My power is my own, only for my taking. Yet the truth is, I'm afraid to make waves. How do I risk hurting another in order to save myself? How do I walk the fine line of living what really matters? Who am I from all that has become me? How do I leave the house and the rooms of my parents and family in order to find myself? Where is my capacity when only fear seems to prevail? Where is the trail in the wilderness?
So, Beth, I'm wondering where we should begin in this conversation. And in your introduction, you were talking about the challenge and the trickiness of this topic. So perhaps a place to start would be, what is it that keeps us inauthentic?
I think it's that going back to that sense of the introject, the ideas that we've been asked to swallow since birth. And actually, when we're infants, those ideas, the ways of behaving that are modelled for us by our families primarily, but also by society around us. When we're infants, we learn to fit in with whatever that environment is.
Yeah.
And as infants, that's the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
We need to fit with the people around us in order to survive. They're the people that take care of us. They feed us, they shelter us. And they comfort us, they give us love and touch. And without that, from an evolutionary sense, from a mammalian point of view, we won't survive. Mm. So I think that gets hardwired into us as a means of survival and becomes a false sense of safety and security. Mm. But actually, as we grow older, some of those adaptations that we make to our environment become the painted room, become the cage that we are kept in. Mm. And Kohut actually uses the concept of the demon protector, that which we develop to defend ourselves and protect ourselves in infancy becomes the thing that then attacks us, that becomes the thing that brings us ill health and upset.
Lovely. And so you mentioned the painted room, and it reminds you of the painted room. What was the connection with the piece there for you?
I think that sense that it comes back to choice, doesn't it? That if we're living without choice, we're living in somebody else's room. We're not living in the room we've created for ourselves, but we're living to satisfy something else outside of us. And that sense that can become restrictive for us. So I think that for me is what the painted room sort of evokes, is that sense of constraint and that sense of a lack of choice.
Yeah.
That in some way we assume that room is all there is, and that the door is locked.
And that the door is locked, it's sealed. And there's some lines that come to mind from the piece as well. You know, we are given an identity to adopt. It becomes folded into us and we take up the mold. And at some point in the piece, it says, we're caught in this cage, as you describe it, like as urgently as dye takes to white linen. And so there's this kind of sealing in order to be saved and to find our place in life. And yet, as you mentioned, and the piece touches as well, we're living in a fabricated shelter and under another's roof, because it's a conditioning we've been given, and at a certain point in our life that can begin to work against us and not with us.
And it's that those lines in there as well about it being so closely woven, and as though like clothing, tight clothing that we can't see perhaps, or we can't see a way out of, because it's what we've grown to believe is normal or is the only way. Yeah. And actually that's why things like talking therapy help, because we start to realize and open up to a more objective perspective of our life and our conditioning, that allows us to see the ways in which actually that there is choice, there's many more options available than we perhaps perceive there to be.
So 2 words there that really stand out for me: seeing and choice. And I think one of the things the painted room speaks to me is the blindness of it. Time and time again, when I listen to the painted room and I like the piece, it speaks very well to where I found myself. But I always see a person sitting in a room looking out of a window, never quite in life. Life is there. There is actually a door there, but they're just looking through, and they're just, the room keeps them. And I think the words are, the room keeps us, and we would never even think to ask it to yield. And so we don't know what we don't know, and yet there's this blindness. And so the way towards the doorway and the way through the doorway you're touching on now is about being able to see the blindness, and then being able to talk and speak and find a way of understanding who we are out of all that we've become.
Yeah, and that sense of not thinking to ask it to yield.
Yeah,
there's something there about taking up space that I so often see in myself and in the people that I work with. That sense of not having a capacity to ask for our needs to be met.
Yes,
and not wanting to put other people out. I mean, I think it's a peculiarly British conditioning, but also, very much prevalent in other cultures as well. That sense that we don't want to put other people out of their way. It's I'll subjugate my needs in order that I definitely don't impinge on what you might want to do right now.
Yeah, and it reminds me that the sitting at the window and the subjugation of needs. When I first started writing the wilderness work, I talked about 2 lives. One on the surface, a kind of veneer, a mask, and adapted me, I'm okay. And a second one called Lost Within, this sense of inner lack and incompleteness, out of touch, confused, lost. And until we see the painted room, and until we take this personal exploration and journey, then we don't begin to deal with what's on the inside and what we're left with, and what influences a lot of the way we see ourselves and the way we live. I'd probably say the way we survive, actually.
Yeah, and I think it is. I don't think it's hyperbolic to talk about survival in the context of these, and in terms of our psychological makeup.
Yeah.
Like as I said earlier, so much of what we sort of arrive at in adulthood has been built for us through childhood and infancy, and the adaptations we make then, when it's very much about survival, but that doesn't go away. We don't leave that part of us behind us. It goes with us, and so we're always checking our environment to keep ourselves safe, to be able to survive. We're pack animals, and so we need to be able to survive within the pack and not be at danger of being exiled from it.
I really get that. And what it brings to mind for me, though, is that the painted room and this early conditioning can bring a narrow bandwidth, which we take to be a sense of self. And that narrow bandwidth, it really kind of reduces our options. It almost gives us a thirst for someone less than we really are. And yet in this world today, there's so many things that's accessible to us, so much more than was before. And so you can have a narrow bandwidth, but a whole shopping center of opportunities, programs, courses, the next thing, so many things. And the mixture of the narrow bandwidth and the kind of constant shopping can keep us very distracted, and we might not even have wondered whether we have left the painted room or not.
Yeah, and I think that sort of excess of choice that you talk about, I think really compounds that sense of stuckness, because where there's so many choices, when you go to the supermarket and there's 140 cheeses to choose from, how the heck do you make decisions based on who you are and what you really want, when there's so much that can cloud our judgment? And actually, I think as human beings, we're not made to have that many choices. We're not made to have so much confusion, because it actually, like you say, it distracts us from being able to listen to our own true self, our own true direction.
Yeah, and in a very simple way then, Beth, this kind of beginning in the painted room, in the conditioning, in finding our place, in our adaptations, life distances us from ourselves. And so in one very simple way, this is the journey to be taken, that we need to find back to ourselves. And without making the topic unnavigable, because it is definitely navigable, the net result of all of what we've talked about, when we look the other side of the window, is external pressures, obligations, sacrifices, expectations, all these things together with fears that begin to play upon our capacity to navigate, to choose, to find our way. And these were we can even have an authentic impulse, but it has a distorting filter on it, and so we can have a sense of it emerging. I might have a sense of, it's time to stand up and speak right now to this person about what's happened. And then I can have a distorting filter on, but what do they think? What will they think? And what will it do to the family? What will it do to the group? And so this navigation and developing this thread that you spoke to, thread to core, this expression of who we are, is a journey and takes time.
Yeah, and I think that I just sort of got that quite a visceral feeling from you sort of talking about that, that conversation where you go, oh, what would so-and-so think? Or, what will this do? What impact will this have? The hardest things is when you've developed that external locus of valuation, that sense that other people hold your value rather than you holding it yourself. You're trapped in this place where you feel like any move you make could potentially destroy them or destroy their image of you.
Yeah.
And actually, you're not leading from a place of connecting with your own inner compass. You're trying to predict and project onto other people what they might want or need or expect. And therefore it becomes, when you start to imagine not doing that, all you can imagine is that would cause destruction around you. And so I think that is part of that stuckness, is that sense that you are somehow more powerful for it, and that your power would take away from other people's somehow.
Yeah, it's lovely. And part of the wilderness work, and why I wanted to bring it out, was to emphasize the fact that in finding this doorway, in finding this path, in awakening to possibility of shaping and authoring our lives, we have to, the struggle and the stuckness is part of the journey. It's part of what gradually brings us to the point of seeing the painted room and seeing the window and seeing us sitting, and begin to define and to shape a response, rather than what has become a habit, a habitual way of being. So I think we've got a sense of the trickiness of the web and the layers, shall we call it that. Just to ask you, what is the cost of this inauthentic stance, and what's the benefit, do you think?
Well, I think that was sort of where we sort of slightly got to there, was that sense of having that external, that somehow your value as a human gets outsourced to those around you, and that it doesn't live within you. And it becomes very precarious then, because you can do something that could throw their opinion of you or reduce your value in their eyes. But actually, if you own that value for yourself, then no matter what you do or mistakes you make, because we are all human, then nothing can destroy our sense of our own worth and our own value when we hold it within. If we allow it to be owned by those around us, then there's a potential that it drops in value. But if it's ours and only ours, then we get to be the person who decides on our own sense of worth and value. I think there's something really important about that, but also quite terrifying, that sense of bringing it in and owning it for yourself. For many of us, it's not how we were raised, it's not how it was modelled for us. So it can be a really terrifying step to take, because we're conditioned to look around us and to respond to the people about us. I think it comes at great cost. I've certainly seen clients for whom that's a very prevalent part of their process. And for them, very small decisions are very difficult to make, because they're making it based on a projection of what other people around them might want or think. So actually they're unable to guide themselves or navigate their own life, because every single moment is governed by this self-conscious sense of what others might be judging in their actions. So I think that's a great cost, is not being able to navigate our way. And I also think actually with all that projecting onto other people what they might want of us, we don't come across as very clear. So actually we can come across as difficult to read. And that can have its own impact on the people around us. Whereas actually if we're grounded and in our own sort of sense of self, there's a clarity there. And people might not like it. It's not necessarily a popular place to be. But it's very clear. And we're able to hold our boundaries with others in a much more clear way that means that we don't get swept into difficulties, I think.
Lovely. And as you're talking, I my mind has gone onto Queen as well, because she's such a person in such a situation. And there's a couple of lines there. I must offer my dying on this altar, if that is what you wish, for I will die for you. What I will not do is live for you. For every step that marks my way must come from within. And this is the dichotomy, isn't it? This is the piece. And particularly in life, when it's really important moments, lifestyle choices, relationship choices, career choices, very personal preferences and choices, we can die on an altar, or we can say, I have a kingdom of my own that needs a ruler, and begin this this work with our own forest. And so you bring that up for me, and I really get this sense of there can be real regret from an unlived life or a part-lived life, and that there is safety in being at the effect of the world rather than the cause of your life. And there is safety in someone speaking for you. And I think what we're trying to say, you and I, Beth, it's not like every moment really is an authentic moment, though this relationship with self and this connection with core can begin to define and refine a moment-to-moment experience. But there are times when it's very important to have awareness, have choice, and to have a responsibility rather than a resignation. And it makes me think about Viktor Frankl and the work about a meaningful life. And, you know, the last of the greatest freedoms left to man and woman is this ability to choose our attitude, our response, and to find our way, even when it appears there's a no choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many huge concepts that you've sort of gone through there just in that short moment, and I think it's one of the things that I recognise as being the hardest part of the journey is that sense of self-responsibility and getting that balance right between that sense of being overly responsible and absolutely not responsible at all in the victim state, and actually finding that sort of that pendulum swing between the two and allowing it to sort of settle at a place where we recognise our own capacity to guide and lead our life. And how difficult that is, how hard a shift that is to make.
Yes.
And being able to open up so many other concepts because of it, and really review our lives in a new way based on that different lens, which for some reason we're not sort of naturally kind of taught about or brought to understand. And it's certainly something that as a mother I'm trying to engender with my sons, this sense that nobody can make you feel any way you don't want to feel. And it's a very big and hard concept that I recognise a lot of adults in my life don't really kind of get. But trying to kind of bring some of that to my sons, this sense that no matter how hard it might feel, ultimately you do have a choice.
Yes. And as we're talking about this, I sense that we are really embracing that spectrum that we talked about of challenge and opportunity. But let's make it really real. Invitation to you, Beth. Can you share an authentic moment, a stand that you made that we could look at or look into? And if you don't wish to, I'm happy to bring one. But I think there's something for me about making this real, because when it's real, and we can see and we can know and things are revealed.
I do, yeah. And I think you're right. It certainly needs the stories and the narrative to kind of be able to bring this into reality. And I think for me, I've got quite a few sort of professional moments, but probably the biggest and most profound for me was with respect to my family of origin and the family system that I grew up with, whereby there was a sort of an avoidance in that of some quite difficult truths. And I found myself sort of in adulthood, and once I was a mother, really needing to challenge some of the ideas of that family that didn't sit with me anymore, that were no longer comfortable for me to bear.
Yeah.
And in doing so, my expectation or my drive, I suppose, was to speak my truth, to own my truth, to walk my path. Not to hurt others intentionally, but also to have to consider my needs over theirs in that moment.
Yeah.
And to speak my truth where it wasn't really going to be welcomed or heard. In doing so, I lost my family, so ended up becoming estranged from them. And that, of course, you know, it's possible to talk about now, 3 years hence, but that was a very long journey towards owning, accepting, coming to terms with my own truth, and holding on to that thread that we talked about earlier, because it didn't feel like absolutely the right thing to do. It didn't feel like, great, I'm in my authentic self. This is perfect now. I'm doing the right thing. It was a very layered and very nuanced process of building and searching and connecting with myself over time, and, you know, going through huge amounts of doubt and disruption and disagreement, and it was a turbulent journey. And I think the word authentic doesn't really kind of pay tribute to the battlefield that can be internally and externally.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, so that we can be with you, and I'm sure all of us can relate to personal and professional parallels in this, but in your experience, I was hearing some things that I want to draw out. The first thing that really struck me was the self-awareness piece, your own forests, and, you know, this piece about starting to know, you know, the inner compass, the thread, the connection, you know, like in Queen, sip yourself, come out of hiding and take residence in your being. And this piece is essential, because otherwise trying to navigate it is very difficult. But I also heard, you know, compassionate consideration, considering the whole, having a sense of the truth, but considering the whole and considering how it might be, and how you might do this. There is some kind of really important piece of the reflection process and the self-reflection process that is inclusive of others as well, and understanding, you know, the enormity of it. It's almost like knowing your shadow, and including that, and even, you know, speaking to it. I mean, in Queen, she spoke. There is a power in me spilling all of my parents' wishes. You know, and I think you hold a message here. Let me check it out with you. That when we start, we almost have to leap to know. When we start, there is an essence of truthfulness. This is the courage of truthfulness. But we don't really know how it is, you know, the authentic stance, until we've been through it, and as we go through it, and somehow it becomes forged and formed, reclaimed and discovered as we go. Does this make sense with you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, again, that sort of resonates with the painted room, because unless we make that leap, unless we find that wilderness, we remain in our painted room, we remain hesitant and questioning. And once we have the awareness, then we have the choice, and we can choose to stay stuck, or we choose to move into the wilderness. And it's a place of not knowing. It's not a place of certainty or direction or precedent. It's a place of unknowing.
Yeah.
Like you say, with that sense of compassion, I think that's really important for me, and it hasn't come up yet in terms of the talk about authenticity. But I've met sort of many people, as I'm sure you have, and the listeners have, who might say something along the lines of, well, that's just who I am, and I just say what I think, and I don't care what other people think of me, and I'll just tell it how it is. And I think there's a defensiveness in there, certainly, that belies something beneath it. But also, I don't think that's what we're talking about when we speak about authenticity. It's not about do whatever you have to, regardless of other people. That's certainly not where I come from in my perspective. And that we shouldn't necessarily kind of, you know, barge our way through life causing pain regardless, because it will serve our needs.
Yes.
And actually, most of us we're so conditioned the other way that we fear that might be what we fear doing.
Yes.
But actually, that's sort of sociopathic. You know, that's a different end of the extreme that we're most of us unlikely ever to touch.
I'm really glad we're having this conversation with the real example, because I think we're touching the unique nuances of making authentic choices. And I was reflecting as you were talking, and I was thinking about some words again in Queen and her stand. This is the beauty you see, and making her stand. It was a very risky thing to do, you know, to make that kind of stand and to be willing to be that visible. And there's something about hiding versus visibility that's at stake in these moments, and having to put word to it, and having to be clear that there is this power in me that can do this damage, and yet I have a kingdom of my own that needs a ruler. I must go into my forest and meet myself and complete this life that you have graced with a beginning. And so it's a fine line.
It is that stepping into power. That's the, you know, stepping into your own power, owning your own power, recognizing how powerful you are and how terrified we can be of that, of our own power. And I think there's something for me, the very, very visceral sort of imagery of her cutting her wrist, of showing her blood, of showing her insides in that way. And I think that's been part of my journey, has been learning to show my pain in a way that enables me to be seen and heard, and opening myself up in ways that allow that vulnerability in order to enable connection, but also to enable me to guide myself through that and trust myself that I am enough to do that.
I'm enough to do that. And when you were speaking, there's something noble in how you just spoke for me, in that willingness to be with that vulnerability. And if I go back to Queen one more time, there's a line in there. It says, when she was standing by the thrones and severing her hair and saying, here's the beauty, and making her statements, it says, her statement, the act that would make of her a queen. So it wasn't clear cut. It wasn't clear cut. We don't stand as ruler of our kingdom and queen. We act and leap and take steps. And somehow in that, we come to a point where we see it in ourselves, and we are seen in that. You know, look how the crowd responded. She's nobility itself. She's royalty itself. So much has gone unseen, and maybe so much had gone unseen in her till that moment.
Yeah, and I think for her, there's a really sort of there's a time on it, isn't there? You know, there's this sense of there being the coronation, and this sense of it's got to be now or never. There's not a sort of prolonged things ticking along as they can. You know, it's fine. I read a thing, Glennon Doyle's book Untamed, and she talks about being fine is actually a dying inside. Because while we're going along being fine, we're not actually living. We're not out there noticing and experiencing. We're sort of just settling and allowing for something that is fine. It's nothing, is it? And there's something about this imperative, this moment, which perhaps a lot of us don't get. We don't get that threshold moment that Queen does, that says now or never. And actually, we have to somehow create those moments for ourselves.
Yes.
Be a consequence to staying stuck.
Yes. And I think there is, we don't get the throne moment, but there are so many moments when we hand over our kingdom, hand over our power, and hand over our rulership. And there's a couple of lines that always sing out to me in Queen more than any others. And it says, as the door's closing and she sees the grief, she has the compassion, you know, she sees it, and she says, with deepest sorrow and yet clearest view, I must put this precious life for living ahead of you. And this is the taking the throne. This is the wearing the crown. This is the peace. And the sad thing, and even when I look back in my own life, I have had my own authentic stands. And I also have had moments where I've not put on the crown, and life could have been different. I'm learning. It's not a judgment, but what the message of the piece is to say, there are moments and periods of life when we have to put this precious life for living ahead of others in order to live and in order to fulfill. And this kind of brings me on to another question, and I'll maybe connect over with a point of view, because one of the things I ponder about is, what is the measure of authenticity? When we are living authentically and choosing authentic living, what's the measure of it? What do we notice? And I want to include that word fulfillment, because life is full of achievement and full of a lot of things that are gained and done. And achievement is good. It's important. It's important to have a place. It's important to shape and make. But I also want to introduce this idea of fulfillment, being filled full, and how, in my experience, a measure of authenticity is not just achievement, but also this sense of fulfillment, which has something to do with feeling alive and feeling our own power as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's a feeling of always being at choice. Knowing that every moment is a choice, every decision is a choice. And that might be, going to the party I don't want to go to, or it might be, big decisions about career paths or big fundamental relationship changes. But actually just knowing deep down that each moment, each part is a choice that's being made. And I think I notice when I'm not authentic, when I feel put upon or resentful towards people around me, then I know that I've slipped out of my authenticity, because I've been saying yes to things that I don't want to do, or I've been agreeing where I meant to disagree. And actually I've found myself in a position where I'm feeling resentful, and I'm feeling as though others are taking from me and I'm no longer giving freely.
Yes.
And that for me is a marker of when I've slipped, because, my God, it is that daily practice. It's not an end destination.
Yeah, and I want to, as you the performer of Queen, and I remember vividly the day when you and I recorded that piece together, but I want to give you her last lines from what you've just said. And her last lines are, even in the darkness, how wonderful, even in the darkness, to know my colour. And that's what I think you're speaking to here, in that ebb and flow, and in that untruthfulness and truthfulness. Amidst all of that, with this quality of presence and being with self, we come to know our colour. And
Adrian, it's probably, when I hear that, I love that part of it very dearly. And it's something interesting in me, because I always want to disagree with Queen at that moment. And far be it for me to disagree with Queen. But for me, there's a sense that only in the darkness can I see my true colour. And maybe that just speaks to my own experience, but there was something about the periods of darkness that I have endured. That was when I found out who I was. That was when I found out what my colours were. And throughout the pain and the harshness of it, actually, even during it, there was this sense of real living, of being back in my rightful place.
Yeah.
Because it was more authentic to be in pain and darkness than it was to be pretending to live a life that was fine.
Yeah. Well, and having a little bit of insight as author, I truly believe Queen would not disagree with you. And she knew darkness, and she knew the darkness of the forest and the night sky, and she knew the shadow of herself. She was by no means arrogant in her stand. She said, I must go into my forest. I must complete myself, and one day when I am worthy. So I think you make a beautiful point, but I just also want to say I think she would agree with you.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Sort of coming back to this piece to discuss it with you like this. When I've been on a huge sort of developmental and emotional and psychological journey since recording that piece. And it's really interesting sort of coming back round towards discussing it in this way, that when I recorded it, that piece spoke to me like no other and has stayed and been a vibration there for me ever since. But it wasn't consciously there when I was having to make these difficult choices. It wasn't sort of, I wasn't consciously acting from that place. But it's interesting to observe how much of that must have gone in, and how much I think I've been impacted and perhaps changed by the reading of Queen, by the living of Queen in the way that I had the privilege of doing. That actually it's there in so much of what I've had to do since then. And to come back to it from this position, it resonated then, but now I see so much more and recognize myself so much more in it even than I did then.
Lovely. I feel it makes me feel emotional listening to you speak this way about Queen, and it's very heartwarming to know that the piece can hold you many times more than once, and that there's a vibration of it. Lovely words. There's a vibration of it that's stayed. I think this is this is the joy of evocative word. So many times in my life, you write poetry, and I don't think I've ever used the word poetry. But this is the joy of evocative word, that it can be descriptive and in the moment and inclusive. And I think this is what you're speaking to. There's a part of the story of Queen and Queen herself that becomes your own and completed by you.
And I would really, possibly this is something that's been talked about previously, but I would really encourage the listeners to speak these words, and to do it in a way of ritual and ceremony. So I had the privilege of being the person who stood in the recording room and worked with you, and got to really sort of involve myself very deeply in the words and the life of the Queen. And I would really encourage listeners to connect with it in that way. It's very different from reading it on the page silently, and actually owning some of these words and allowing these words to take up a physical place in you.
Yes.
And it reaches different parts of you. Hearing your own voice speak these words impacts you on another level that's beyond that conscious cognitive level of reading.
Wonderful. And I think we've really covered the breadth and depth here, and to bring the topic kind of into some sort of closing moment, though it's very difficult to do so, I'd like to take this idea that you said, Beth, about you in the story of Queen. And there are a couple of really, I think, inspirational questions to ponder from time to time. How am I showing up in my own story? How am I showing up in my own story? And how do I wish to be showing up in this story? And maybe these kinds of pieces and this kind of work, and even the ritual of savoring the words, can get us to really understand and embrace our human condition and still find our way. And from this clay, find our way. And so we're coming to a close, Beth. Are there any last words you'd like to offer the listener as we begin to close?
Yeah, I think for me, the key to a lot of this, to finding one's own authenticity, and something that I have experienced and that I offer to clients, is a first step of really listening to your body and noticing the sensations in your body, moment to moment, day by day, just checking in and going, how do I feel when I think about this, when we have a decision to make? And, be that between Edam and Cheddar, or the party or not the party, or the job promotion or redundancy, or whatever it is, really stopping and taking notice of what our body is telling us. Because our body is the ultimate guide and doesn't have all of those intellectual introjects that we carry around with us. and will guide you if you allow it. So I think that really that settling in and that listening to one's own physical self is a key towards finding that authentic path, that thread that will hold you steady.
Lovely, lovely. And if we could put that at the center, I would put two pieces, one either side. So first nurture being, and then have this day-to-day inquiry, gentle practice. And then as a kind of at the window looking outwards, choose life. Choose to live, choose precious life. Lovely. Thank you, Beth. I've really enjoyed talking with you. I could talk and talk. We could talk and talk. We know one another well, but this is the first time we've ever sat down and had a conversation around a core theme like this. What's the experience been like for you?
It's been really wonderful, actually. It's been incredibly evocative. And like you, I sort of feel like I could keep going. I've got a lot of energy for this. And this type of exploration where we're sharing with one another, but also, you know, a sense of that being taken out into the wider world as well. And it brings new concepts, it brings new perceptions up. So yeah, I found it incredibly rich, and I really appreciate you asking me to contribute in this way. It feels like an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you, friends, for taking time with this podcast and conversation today. We look forward to sharing more of the series with you soon. So until next time, be well. And on behalf of Adrian, I would like to finish with the familiar words. Remember, each conscious step counts.